Buongiorno, benvenuti a questo evento di tecnologia con David Goodhart e io sono Raffaele Alberto Ventura. David Goodhart che ha appena pubblicato qualche mese fa questo libro per Treccani che si chiama Testa, Mano, Cuore. David Goodhart è giornalista, autore di diversi libri. Prima di questo ha pubblicato The Road to Somewhere, che ha fatto molto discutere nel Regno Unito ma anche nel dibattito internazionale. È fondatore anche della rivista Prospect Magazine e don't forget anything for your presentation. Is the main, principale. Avremo una traduzione simultanea di David Goodhart che parlerà in inglese. Io vi faccio una piccola introduzione, poi farò alcune domande a David. Piccola introduzione che parte un po' dal tema, no, di oggi, che dal titolo è Andare al massimo. Non so se l'implicito è evidente, ma si parla di merito. E quando è stato deciso questo tema, qualche mese fa mi pare, insomma un bel po' di tempo fa, era prima che tornassero d'attualità alcuni dibattiti che sono stati rilanciati principalmente, lo dico anche all'attenzione di David, ne abbiamo parlato prima, ma insomma per mettere un po' nel contesto italiano la sua riflessione sul merito. Come forse ricordate,
il nuovo Ministero Istruzione e Merito ha suscitato dei dibattiti attorno a questa parola. Ha suscitato dei dibattiti principalmente per due ragioni. La prima è che in Italia il tema del merito è un tema spinoso e questa parola di merito nel nome del Ministero è suonata un po' ipocrita in un paese in cui si percepisce, e probabilmente anche a ragione, una mancanza di merito, delle gerarchie sociali e economiche che non rispettano il merito o che usano il merito come pretesto. Questa è la prima ragione. La seconda è che in realtà fuori dall'Italia abbiamo un dibattito che in realtà è quasi di segno opposto, cioè un dibattito in paesi in cui in realtà il merito c'è o viene percepito come esistente, si parla di meritocrazia, ma negli ultimi anni si è cominciato a attirare l'attenzione sul fatto che questa meritocrazia nasconde o produce addirittura delle ineguaglianze e delle ingiustizie. E su questo appunto trovate tanta letteratura. Io avevo provato a fare una sintesi quando uscì il libro di David un paio di anni fa in un articolo che era uscito su Domani. Citavo anche Michael Sandel che ha fatto in America un libro sulla tirannia del merito, e David Goodhart invece per il Regno Unito ha fatto quello che è stato probabilmente il libro più discusso. David ci farà una piccola presentazione delle sue idee, quindi poi anche con l'aiuto di alcune slide. Io dico due cose introduttive sul concetto di meritocrazia senza farvi la storia del concetto, che è stata insomma, nell'ultimo periodo molto fatta e molto discussa. Ma per attirare l'attenzione su quello che secondo me è un po' il paradosso in cui ci troviamo, nel senso che noi nel passaggio dall'antico regime, tornando insomma 2 secoli fa alla società moderna, ci siamo trovati di fronte come società alla necessità di trovare un meccanismo per superare diciamo le ineguaglianze legate alla nascita, legate alla feudalità, e quindi con Napoleone, poi insomma un po' dappertutto, in tutta Europa, in tutto il mondo, in tutto l'Occidente perlomeno, si sono sviluppati dei sistemi di esami pubblici, di come dire, quantificazione del valore che dovevano servire ad assegnare le persone alla loro posizione più idonea alla vita sociale, al sistema produttivo. Idea che tra l'altro in qualche modo Napoleone e i francesi prendono dai cinesi, prendono dall'impero cinese, da questi esami imperiali che suscitavano molta ammirazione e anche forse un po' di spavento. La meritocrazia nasce un po' in questo contesto storico, poi il Massimo David, se non è d'accordo, aggiungerà o correggerà. oltre alla questione del pubblico, diciamo, dello sistema educativo, c'è anche la questione del mercato, la concorrenza, e anche questo è uno dei temi che nasce con l'età moderna e che viene subito criticato. Appunto, a metà Ottocento Alexis de Tocqueville critica quest'idea di una società in cui tutti, essendo in concorrenza, di fatto ci si trova tutti anche in un conflitto permanente, proprio perché tutti competiamo per le stesse posizioni. Oggi chi difende il merito, di fatto, pensiamo al dibattito italiano, lo difende proprio in quanto alternativa a questi modelli feudali che in Italia permangono probabilmente un po' di più rispetto al mondo anglosassone. Credo questa può essere una delle differenze. E sicuramente il merito, la meritocrazia ha avuto un potenziale disruptive in un certo senso rispetto a certi fenomeni premoderni, tipicamente italiani, però ha creato altri problemi ed è qui che David Goodhart ci fornisce molte indicazioni interessanti, molte indicazioni utili. Il punto centrale, come vedrete, è quello dell'ineguaglianza nella ripartizione dello status sociale, nel senso che noi, forse la tradizione, diciamo, materialista, marxista, novecentesca si è molto concentrata sulle ineguaglianze economiche, poi insomma progressivamente nel corso del Novecento, ancora di più negli anni 60 e 70, si è iniziato a parlare anche delle diseguaglianze di status, quindi non soltanto quanto abbiamo come capitale economico, ma quanto abbiamo come ognuno di noi come capitale sociale, come siamo giudicati dagli altri. E il sistema meritocratico ha questa tara sostanziale che, ordinando le persone in un certo modo, no? Gerarchizzandole in funzione del loro merito, delle loro capacità, crea delle ineguaglianze. Quindi c'è quello che viene chiamato con un gioco di parole il peak head da David, che è un calco su peak oil, no? Il picco del petrolio, quando si arriva a un picco e non si può più andare oltre. Quindi un picco, dicevamo di prima, della classe intellettuale, una sproporzione, diciamo, come se il corpo sociale, questo per, diciamo, tornare al titolo, no? Testa, mani, cuore, è come se le nostre società avanzate, complesse, fossero dei corpi con una testa molto grande e poi, o meglio, una testa che riceve la maggior parte delle risorse, proseguendo la metafora del flusso di sangue, insomma, e poi invece la mano e il cuore che ne ricevono di meno. E quindi questa ineguaglianza è quella che interessa molto David Goodhart nei suoi libri. I suoi libri, appunto questo e anche quello prima, The Road to Somewhere, che è famoso anche perché ha popolarizzato e diffuso l'idea di un'opposizione tra due tipologie di persone nel modo in cui perlomeno la società o addirittura la retorica populista percepisce la strutturazione sociale, cioè gli anywheres e i somewheres, quelli che in fin dei conti sono radicati in un territorio e non possono andare altrove, e quindi i somewheres, e gli anywheres che invece possono essere dappertutto, possono lavorare dappertutto, possono aprire il loro laptop e andare in una città, una capitale di solito, oppure un'altra. E quando ci siamo sentiti al telefono 2 giorni fa, un po' per preparare questo incontro con David Goodhart, lo cito come aneddoto per mostrare quanto siamo, come dire, coinvolti anche in questa dinamica. Io l'ho chiamato, gli ho detto "Hi, I'm Raffaele from Italy", per fare breve, però ero a Parigi, quindi lui subito mi ha detto "ma io vedo un numero di francese e oggi siamo io appunto io vengo da Parigi, lui viene da Londra, poi lui riparte oggi, io riparto domani, insomma siamo degli anywheres in un certo senso. Non so quanto siamo, diciamo, degli anywheres, no, privilegiati, quanto sia dorata la nostra vita, e dopo io porrò alcune domande anche su questo, su, in fin dei conti, questa strana elite con un piede nel benessere e un piede nel disagio, no? E quindi, insomma, noi poi, adesso è un po' passato di moda, no? Ma fino a qualche anno fa, mi ricordo le biografie degli scrittori erano sempre appunto vive tra Parigi e Milano, tra Londra e Gubbio, però in fin dei conti, questa forse ci vergogniamo un po', quindi abbiamo un po' smesso di usare questo tipo di messa in scena che ovviamente ci fa apparire, no, molto internazionali, però è così, però alla fine è così, e siamo degli anywheres anche non per scelta, anche perché siamo obbligati a farlo, anche perché dobbiamo andare a cercare altrove del lavoro, insomma, ma questo magari ne parliamo dopo. Quindi c'è un misto, no, di privilegio e di disagio, di cui sarà interessante, credo, discutere, e discutere anche delle differenze tra l'Italia, il Regno Unito e gli Stati Uniti, sapendo che secondo me l'analisi di David Goodhart resta comunque, anche se con intensità variabili, molto interessante anche per capire le disparità nella società italiana. E lascio subito la parola a David e poi poi discutiamo un pochino.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Raffaele, for that introduction. Apologies, I am now going to speak in English, but I will try and speak relatively slowly and relatively clearly. If I talk too fast, shout at me and I will slow down. Thanks very much to the Biennale for my invitation. I'm very happy to be in Turin. I've never been to Turin before. It's my first time. It's a lovely place. I have no idea why it drove Nietzsche mad, which it apparently did. Anyway, my recent work, as Raffaele was saying, my recent work has sort of been about trying to understand the great alienation of the last couple of decades, particularly. I just have to mention a few words: Brexit, Trump, possibly Meloni. The great alienation of many of our fellow citizens, despite living in what, by any historical comparison, are incredibly successful, rich, free countries. But lots of our fellow citizens feel discomforted, feel unrecognized, feel their contributions are not fully recognized. So just in this, hang on, I need to give you, the first slide is a kind of overview of really what I'm arguing in this book, Head, Hand, Heart, that we had this great opening, particularly at the end of the Cold War, from the 1990s through more or less to the present day. We've had European societies have been mainly characterized by what one might call the two liberalisms, economic liberalism, obviously qualified. We have big states, we have welfare states, we have a huge amount of state intervention and so on, but nonetheless, market-driven societies to a significant extent. And the social liberalism, the great liberalization that we've seen on everything from the idea of the nation state, race, gender, sexuality. All of our countries have been becoming incredibly more open and incredibly more liberal in popular attitudes. And along with this has come a big cultural and educational divide. And here I'm not ignoring socioeconomic divides. They remain very important, of course. But it's these other divides, as Raffaele was saying, divides of status and recognition and ideas of contribution that have become at least as important, I think, as the more traditional left-right socioeconomic class divides that we're more used to talking about. And my contribution, as it were, to the language of these new divisions was to talk about, as Raffaele mentioned, to talk about the people from anywhere and the people from somewhere, the people who see the world from anywhere, the people who see the world from somewhere. And very, very basically, by the anywheres, I mean people who are generally highly educated, mobile. The two things often go together, particularly in my country. Almost all undergraduates, all university students in Britain, about 75, 80%, go to residential universities. So you leave your hometown, the people you grew up with, the school that you went to, and you move to another city and you join another socio-cultural group. The anywheres are a minority, but a very dominant minority in our societies, and in a way therein lies the problem. Somewheres, on the other hand, tend to be less well educated, tend to prioritize security and familiarity. They're more rooted people generally. Another way of looking at the same phenomenon is actually through the lens of what the American sociologist Talcott Parsons talked about: ascribed and achieved identities. Educated people tend to have achieved identities, meaning that your sense of yourself comes from your own achievements. You did well at school, you went to university, you have a more or less successful professional career, and that means you have a sense of yourself that is derived from your own achievements, and that makes your identity kind of more portable, more resilient in some ways. You know, you can live anywhere. You can live in the edgy inner city and feel perfectly comfortable. If, on the other hand, you have, by the way, we all have identities that are on a kind of spectrum with achieved at one end and ascribed at the other. If you have an ascribed identity, it's one that it's things about yourself that you can't change, or certainly not easily. You know, you're a white, male, British, northern working class person. You can't really change those things about yourself. And your identity, if you have a mainly ascribed identity, your identity is much more tied up with group and place, the group that you grew up with, the place that you come from. And therefore, ascribed identities are much more liable to being discomforted by rapid social change. I mean, I think, you know, in a nutshell, I think therein lies our problem with the alienation of very large parts of our societies. People who still have primarily somewhere ascribed identities, who do not like the enormous demographic changes. You know, a town like London, when I was young, it was sort of 85, 90% white British people. It's now about 35% white British people. I mean, this is an enormous demographic way of life change in a very short period of time. Anyway, so along with this anywhere, somewhere, value distinction that has emerged. And by the way, I should stress that both of these, both the anywhere worldview and the somewhere worldview, are both perfectly decent worldviews. It's just that one has become very dominant in our society, and hence the kind of instability in our politics. So along with this, we've had, over the last 30 or 40 years, in most European countries, we've also had a huge increase in the number of anywheres, partly through the expansion of higher education. We have mass higher education systems now in all our societies. And in this period, I think there's a sense that, you know, a certain kind of human aptitude, cognitive ability, has become sort of the gold standard of human esteem. You know, perhaps not so much now, but, you know, 10 years ago, if you asked almost any parents in Europe, from whatever social class background, what did they want for their children? They wanted them to go to university and get a good professional job. That was seen as the kind of only route to safety and success. Now, you might say, what's new about this? Hasn't cognitive ability always been very highly valued? You know, think of the great sort of classical philosophical tradition of Plato, and indeed think of Christianity, you might say, reinforced the idea that there was something sort of pure about the spirit and pure about the mind, whereas the body was subject to temptation and corruption. Now that, of course, is true. That idea has been with us for a long time. But what hasn't been with us for a long time is a mass highly educated, a mass cognitive class. This is a phenomenon, a very, very recent phenomenon, the consequences of which I think we're still digesting and trying to understand. And my argument in a nutshell is that we've allocated too much reward and prestige and indeed pay to cognitive professional occupations, and many people who work with their hands and their hearts, people who work in manual technical jobs, who work in caring jobs, many of those people feel that their contribution has been relatively undervalued in recent decades. And like I say, this is a very recent phenomenon. I don't know the figures for Italy, but for the UK, as recently as the 1970s, as recently as 50 years ago, almost half the population left school with basically no qualifications at all. Only about 8%, when I went to university in the late 1970s, only about 8% of the population went to university. As recently as the 1990s, half of the people in the very top social class did not have university degrees. Now everybody would have one. And of course now, in the UK, I think the number is a bit lower in Italy, but now almost half of all school leavers go to a kind of classical university. And about 40% of jobs in the UK economy are more or less formally graduate only, which is one of the things that keeps the whole higher education machine turning. Now, my argument in the book is that we have now reached this thing I call peak head. We've got to a point where the logic no longer works, the economics no longer works, and we are starting to adjust. At least I very much hope we are. And one reason for that is because it turns out the knowledge economy doesn't need very many knowledge workers, as many people out there are discovering. You go to university, get a good degree, or a good enough degree, and you find you're doing some very tedious job for not very much money in a back office of some big company. And we've also had a political pushback against the domination of the sort of anywhere cognitive class. As I say, we've had Brexit, we've had Trump, and we may have him again. And we've had populism in Europe. There we go. I'm afraid these are the only pictures I have. Anyway, as Raffaele said, the Head, Hand, Heart book has just been translated into Italian. Testa, mano, cuore. But we can move on swiftly from that. So that was basically the overview. I mean, just to go into a little bit more detail, as I say, I think as societies, we've allocated too much reward and prestige to just one form of human aptitude. And that has created a reaction, an understandable and in some ways legitimate reaction. But I think what we've also done, and I think these two things are related, is that we've kind of undermined a lot of the sources of traditional unconditional recognition. I mean, a lot of the kind of traditional institutions of society, whether it was the church, the family, the nation, they kind of valued you for who you were, regardless of whether you'd ever passed an exam. You know, you don't have to pass an exam to be loved by your mother. At least I hope not. And a lot of those forms of unconditional recognition have become weaker in our society. They're still there, but they've become a lot weaker in our society. And I think when it comes to the question of social mobility and meritocracy that Raffaele was talking about, too much, as I was saying earlier, too much of what's been happening has been about, as it were, moving from a society in which you had lots of little ladders up, where kind of ambitious and capable people could sort of climb up through all sorts of different institutions. And now you've increasingly, over the last 30 or 40 years, we've created a single ladder up, and that ladder being higher education. A lot of these themes, by the way, were foreseen by Daniel Bell in his book, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society. I don't know whether Daniel Bell is still read in the academy, but his work is definitely worth looking at still. And this creation of this sort of single ladder into mass higher education has produced what I call the 1550 problem. So 30 or 40 years ago, if you were, when about 15% of the population went on to higher education, if the people in your school or your town, if it was only 15% who, you know, the clever kids who went to university, nobody really minded. when it's 50% of people going to university and you're not going to university, you feel, or you're more likely to feel, like a second-class citizen. And particularly, and this may be more true of the United Kingdom than of Italy, particularly what tends to happen is that people who are going to university leave the small town and go to the big city. So the so-called leave to achieve issue. And this has created two alienated groups. I mean, like I say, if in a society which has all this prestige attached to cognitive ability, you're not in that 50% that are going on through university into the kind of cognitive professions, you're going to feel like a second-class citizen. But then there's a whole group of people who do go to university and get their qualifications and then find that there aren't the jobs for them. This is the problem I refer to as the knowledge economy, not actually needing that many knowledge workers. And this is, it's what the American writer Peter Turchin has called elite overproduction. And this is, I think, an increasingly serious problem in many of our societies. People, highly educated people who do not have decent jobs to go into. And this is contributing to the kind of political instability which is at the heart of my inquiry. You know, why is it, as I say, that so many people seem so unhappy in, you know, historically speaking, extraordinarily successful societies? And I think the political instability comes from this big fact of the over-domination of anywhere values, the values of openness, mobility. They tend to be kind of anti-authority, anti-tradition, often a kind of bias against the private realm. Anywheres tend to be very public realm-focused people. And like I say, there's nothing wrong with these things. It's just that they're very, very dominant. And actually, they don't represent the sentiments of many people. Or at least probably not a majority of people. So these are things that people feel are sort of imposed upon them. By the way, in my book, The Road to Somewhere, it sounds very crude and binary, anywheres and somewheres, and probably many of you are thinking, well, hang on, I share some of these anywhere values, but I also, have kind of somewhere feelings too. And actually, there are all sorts of different kinds of anywheres and all sorts of different kinds of somewheres, and I talk about a big so-called in-betweener group so roughly speaking, somewheres, and I haven't just made it, I made up the labels, I didn't make up the value groups, although it was based on attitude surveys and opinion surveys in the UK. About 50% of the population are broadly speaking somewheres, about 25% are in-betweeners, and about 25% are anywheres. Now these figures sort of vary a bit, and I think it's a useful, I think a lot of people have found it quite useful sort of handle on the big changes that have been going on. And it can be it can be a sort of parlor game, am I a anywhere or a somewhere or an in-betweener? It often doesn't quite fit with individual biographies because they're all too different and particular. But anyway, so I think we've got this problem of the political instability of the over-domination of a certain set of, broadly speaking, liberal values, if you like, which is not taken into account what I would call the sort of, the legitimate populist instincts of still lots of people in our societies. And you've also seen this expressed in politics. I think it probably applies as much, if not more in Italy, actually, than the UK. It's what the American conservative writer Christopher Caldwell calls the two constitutions. So there's the first constitution, which is the sort of basics of liberal democracy, voting in elections, the rule of law, et cetera, Then you've got the second constitution, which is increasingly powerful. It's the whole apparatus of sort of judicial activism, civil society, the media. Anywheres tend to dominate the second constitution, and somewheres push back with their votes in the first constitution, which is why you get a sense that Italy may be dominated sort of culturally and in media terms by relatively liberal-minded people, But when it actually comes to election time, you end up with Meloni running the country. And I think that sort of one of our objectives in politics ought to be trying to narrow the gap, as it were, between the two constitutions. They've got too far apart. And of course, what's also been created by the head-hand-heart problem is a big economic misalignment. That we are hugely overproducing people with generalist academic qualifications, and meanwhile, we have huge problems filling vacancies in sort of technician-type jobs. The people that keep the whole show on the road, whether it's our nuclear power stations or our computers, these things they don't necessarily need university degrees to know how to keep them functioning, but they need, a fair amount of technical knowledge. And of course, all European societies have huge recruitment problems in care jobs, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail. How are we doing for time? I should hurry up. No, hang on, which one am I on? Okay. Well, Raffaele talked about this a bit earlier. I'm going to say, one of the ways in which the kind of anywhere cognitive domination has been legitimized is through the concept of meritocracy. But it obviously does have its limits, as Raffaele said. And my book, Head, Hand, Heart, it actually came out roughly at the same time as Michael Sandel's book, a sort of critique of meritocracy book. And annoyingly, they were often reviewed together. And because Michael Sandel is a famous Harvard professor.
That's what I made.
Yeah. Oh, did you say that? All right. Anyway, so people talk more about his book than mine. It's very unfair. So, yeah, I mean, just to sort of unpack the idea of merit a bit. I mean, one of the ways in which I think we're almost unconsciously dominated by notions of cognitive ability is in something like care, the care sector, the care work done in the public economy. So, if you ask an economist, why is it that people who do this, vital work of looking after elderly people in care homes, why are they paid so little? They would say, essentially because anybody can do it. What they mean by that is you don't need high cognitive qualifications to do it. You need very basic qualifications to do it. But that doesn't mean to say that anybody can do it. Anyone who spends half an hour in an elder care home or indeed in a hospital knows there are really good nurses, there are average nurses, and there are poor nurses, just like in any other walk of life. But care work is peculiarly difficult to measure and to quantify. How do you measure the contribution? Think of a geriatric nurse coming off a ward, having after a 10-hour shift, just having made the lives of 20 or 30 old people a little bit less miserable. How do you kind of measure that? And what if the person coming after her, it's usually a her, is perhaps much less good and treats them brusquely and handles them roughly, but they're all on the same pay, and it's often quite low. But I mean, I don't think the problem is not exactly meritocracy. I mean, I think we're all in favour of meritocracy in the sense of wanting the best qualified people particularly in the top jobs. Nobody wants to be operated on by somebody who's failed their surgery exams. We want good people to be in important jobs. We want the most capable people to be in important jobs. So we're all in favour of what one might call sort of labour market meritocracy. We don't necessarily want to live in a meritocratic society, though, one in which the kind of top exam passers dominate everything and everybody else feels like a failure. But I think the problem is not, as I say, with meritocracy itself. It's with the idea of the cognitive meritocracy, the fact that meritocracy has become so narrowly defined by academic success. And basically what we need is a much broader idea of merit. so that it does include, you know, the people who are excellent carers but not very good at passing exams. You know, the people have capabilities that are absolutely vital to society still, and should be rewarded. We need like I say, a more expansive definition of merit and skill, because apart from anything else, you know, the current version creates lots of people who feel like they're failures. I do think it's worth pointing out that the pandemic has actually been quite useful in this respect. You know, we all did the clapping for carers. It gave us a sense of the importance of the people, often quite low-paid, low-status people, who actually keep society working. Now, it doesn't mean to say that we're now paying them a huge amount more, although probably, you know, in the long run, incomes at the bottom are generally rising. Certainly in the UK, we now have a pretty high minimum wage, and that trend is going to go up, I think. And I think the pandemic helped. I mean, it helped to remind us of our interdependence, apart from anything else. And that, you know, like I say, quite low status jobs like stacking shelves in a supermarket. I mean, I used to frighten my children with the idea that if they didn't do their homework, they would end up stacking shelves in a supermarket. And it now turns out that is one of the most vital jobs in society. It's now more visible, at least. They may not be much better paid, but I think you know, now when you go to the supermarket, you kind of remember, oh yes, those people sort of kept us going. And I think, you know, the more somewhere-ish notion of kind of localism and rootedness has certainly, you know, come out with a kind of deeper roots, you might say, in our society after the pandemic. You know, we're much more suspicious of those long supply chains. You know, there is certainly where it's sensible, people are thinking of, you know, can you bring production closer to home again? The overextended supply chain is now kind of the enemy. Anyway, let me hurry through the last couple of slides so that we have time for conversation. So, yeah, I mean, there are obviously a lot of caveats to this argument. I mean, head, hand, heart is obviously ridiculously simplistic. Everything we do is a combination of the kind of cognitive and the embodied and the emotional. I think a lot of these trends are worse in the Anglo-Saxon countries, in the US and the UK. I don't want to sound as if I don't have enormous respect for high intelligence. I mean, you know, high intelligence is going to solve most of our problems. We're not going to change our lifestyles hugely in response to climate change. We are going to ultimately depend on clever people in laboratories coming up with answers to it, just as they did with the vaccine during the pandemic. But the vast majority of people who come out of universities, you know, including myself, we are not going to be, you know, it's a tiny, tiny percentage of people who create real knowledge. The vast majority of us are not creating new knowledge of any kind at all. We're just doing kind of routine things of a cognitive kind rather than a manual kind. I mean, it's really not very different. And of course, some of the changes. I mean, all of our societies, we don't want to go back to a society in which only very rich people go to university, or, you know, particularly privileged or particularly brilliant people from non-privileged backgrounds go to university. I mean, certainly in the UK, it was probably true here too, we undersupplied higher education, you know, right up until probably about 30 years ago. I think we now oversupply it, but with that, you know, you do want 25-30% of people going into higher education, although not necessarily at the age of 18, 19. You know, doing it as a kind of routine thing because you're quite clever, you know, oh, well, I suppose I better go to university. Why not go, you know, after you've worked for a few years, in your mid-20s, your late 20s, you know more about the world, you know more about what you're really interested in, and what you're not interested in. You know, and universities should be full of people bursting with intellectual curiosity, and, you know, they really are not, well, at least whenever I talk to friends who teach in them. So I do think, you know, some of the rise of head was very much necessary and overdue. It was partly there was a huge expansion of the knowledge economy and a huge expansion of the welfare state. The welfare state needs lots of cognitively trained people, lots more teachers and university lecturers and medics and people who need a lot of cognitive training. So that was all. But as I say, I think we've now kind of moved from the point where when I started writing this book and this kind of title came into my head, I thought, that does sound a little bit kind of hippie almost, a bit new agey, head, hand, heart. But in the course of writing it, I came to the view that actually it's not only not particularly new agey, it's absolutely inevitable that this happens. Anyway, I've already touched on this point about the knowledge economy not needing so many knowledge workers. This idea, some of you may know the work of Phil Brown and Hugh Lauder, I think it is, who talk about, it's actually not 20% is too large. It's something like 10, they reckon between 10 and 15% of people in big organizations, both private sector and public sector, actually are using real judgment, real creativity, have any kind of autonomy. Most of us are just drones, cognitively trained drones perhaps, but drones nonetheless. And certainly the story, far too much of our public policy is still based around, I'm speaking here more about the UK than Italy, I don't know the Italian story, but basically so much of our education policy, our social mobility policy, our productivity policy even, is still based on this kind of tired assumption that you just send more and more kids to university and somehow these things magically happen. In the time that we've been expanding universities, or is it Robert Gordon, the American economist, has sort of shown there's almost a kind of reverse correlation between more and more people going to university and productivity increasing. It's been declining in the period when university expansion's been going like gangbusters. Anyway, we've got this point I've made about diminishing returns have set in, the disappointed expectations of so many graduates, and of course we have this crisis of recruitment in care, in the public economy. And nobody's having babies either. And particularly in Italy, you're down to what, 1.2, 1.3 is your fertility rate. Now, I think that's, all of the care problem was brilliantly put by the American academic Amy Wax, who, in the very cold language of economics, she put it like this. She said that the problem with caring is that it has positive externalities for society that the carer cannot capture themselves. So, much care work is, emotionally demanding, very, but very, absolutely essential for society to work, both in the public realm and in the private realm. But the carer cannot capture the true value of what they're doing. And society used to solve that problem by stopping women doing anything else. Now we've broadly removed those restrictions on women, and we're left with a very big problem. and women are choosing, perhaps particularly in Italy, not to have babies because the opportunity cost is too great. The arrangements for combining, a decent job and having more than one child are not very good. Italian men apparently are not doing their share of domestic labour. Come on, boys, you can do better than that. Anyway, so what is the answer apart from Italian men doing more domestic labour? Perhaps I can leave all these my answers and perhaps we can talk about this in the discussion. There are a few obvious points, that we should, I think, shift investment somewhat away. Obviously, we still need lots of good universities, but, we've tended to neglect. Again, I'm talking about the British experience. I suspect it's replicated here to some extent. We've the kind of higher technical traditions have been rather neglected. Basically, higher education has been seen as the only route to safety and success for our children, and I think that's been a very damaging idea. And I also think it's very damaging the way that the lazy way that employers use a university degree as sort of proof of someone's competence. And I'm afraid to say it often really isn't proof of someone's competence. And they should, and we should just try and resist having too many sort of graduate-only jobs. We need non-graduate. A lot of these everyday professions are being turned into, like nursing and policing. And we really should avoid that. Anyway, why don't I stop there and hand back to you, Raffaele.
Thank you, David, for your presentation. I have a lot of questions and devo parlare in italiano, scusate, stavo partendo in inglese. Ho molte domande e è stato molto interessante. E provo appunto, visto che il tempo non è tantissimo, a concentrarle e sollevare magari anche allora una cosa su cui possiamo discutere è una controproposta per le soluzioni, mettiamola così, perché io trovo che l'interesse dell'analisi di David sia che può essere sia un modo di vedere le cose, di vedere come si è trasformata la società, sia un modo di mettere per iscritto un certo modo in cui percepiamo queste trasformazioni, nel senso che c'è, e non lo dico come un'accusa o come una parola negativa, ma un fondo di populismo, no? Cioè, secondo me anche programmatico, anche voluto, nella distinzione per esempio anywhere and somewhere, e io credo che sia una forma di forse uno degli ultimi eredi di quella tradizione di populismo colto, in qualche modo, che in Inghilterra avete avuto A.P. Thompson, per esempio, che parlava dell'economia morale delle classi operaie, in America Christopher Lasch, per esempio, e trovo sia interessante, insomma, porsi queste domande anche alla luce di come queste narrazioni strutturano il campo politico. Ci sono poi echi con altri autori che sono di altre tradizioni, David Graeber per esempio, ovviamente sul lavoro di cura e sul riconoscimento e sulla critica del lavoro intellettuale, perlomeno nella sua forma più burocratica. Nel sollevare questa questione io provo a fare anche una critica, o perlomeno, cioè è anche una critica, ma è anche un modo di vedere che la stessa cosa può essere vista anche in un altro modo. Io credo che oggi stiamo ancora raccogliendo i cocci del collasso del marxismo, nel senso, i cocci della lotta di classe, in cui avevamo due classi chiare, la borghesia e il proletariato. Quel modello lì è entrato in crisi negli anni 60, Daniel Bell è stato uno dei suoi, insomma, uno dei critici più noti, appunto, visto che veniva citato prima, e allora stiamo cercando di ricostruire, di rimodellizzare il corpo sociale in un modo diverso, cioè riprendendo i cocci e assestandoli in modo diverso. Allora noi in Italia abbiamo avuto un modello un po' opposto a questo, che era quello del cognitariato, per esempio, no? Cioè, quindi le classi sono scomposte, la classe media bisogna metterla da qualche parte, e allora nel modello del cognitariato sostanzialmente la classe media creativa molto istruita veniva associata al proletariato. Questo era un modello che io trovavo personalmente totalmente insoddisfacente, e quindi, diciamo, ho una maggiore, diciamo, simpatia per un modello come quello che dice David, cioè di dire no, in realtà la classe media la dobbiamo in realtà aggregare all'alto, in un certo senso, no? Non la dobbiamo aggregare verso il basso, ma aggregare verso l'alto. Ovviamente sono modelli, sono cose molto soggettive e non c'è un modo di ricostruire questa dicotomia in un modo oggettivo, però ovviamente ci sono implicazioni diverse. Allora, premessa questa simpatia per un modello che mette in discussione la classe media istruita, la classe media creativa, che è sicuramente destinataria indirettamente di ampie quote di plusvalore e di redditi tendenzialmente più importanti rispetto a chi fa il lavoro di cura o chi fa lavori manuali. Due cose vanno dette, cioè che questa classe è profondamente scissa al suo interno, ha modelli di reddito, pattern di reddito molto molto diversi, e in Italia soprattutto abbiamo appunto, e questo è stato evocato da David, la disoccupazione interna a questa classe, e poi abbiamo una serie di forme spurie anche, no? Di sottooccupazione, di occupazione precaria, eccetera eccetera. Il rischio della narrazione Anywhere Somewhere è che ci sia, come dire, che si descriva questa classe complessa e a modo suo abbastanza sofferente, soprattutto in Italia, come esclusivamente un'elite. E questo, secondo me, va sollevato. Una seconda cosa che dico, senza appunto dilungarmi troppo, è che in questa dialettica tra alto e basso, tra testa, mano e cuore, manca il capitale economico. Non ne abbiamo parlato abbastanza, ovviamente c'è, e sicuramente David anche nel libro ne parla, però come dire, certo c'è il privilegio della classe cognitiva e il privilegio della classe intellettuale, però la vecchia borghesia in qualche modo esiste, anche se anche lei si sovrappone ovviamente, anzi come anche David nota, è anche chi ha risorse economiche colui che poi può finanziare degli studi migliori. Quindi da un lato vorrei dire abbiamo bisogno di maggiore complessità, e dall'altro io apprezzo tantissimo chi ha il coraggio di proporre modelli, metafore, dicotomie che ci aiutano a capire il mondo, perché modelli troppo complessi non riusciamo a farne niente. Quindi, però secondo me c'è qualcosa lì in quel mezzo, in questa classe media, che ancora ci sfugge, ancora dagli anni 60 non riusciamo a darle un senso a questa classe media. E dico, per lasciare un po' di tempo ancora alla discussione con David, una mia, mia proposta, insomma, il modo in cui secondo me, il punto in cui questo sistema diventa disfunzionale. Cioè questa classe accumula tantissimo prestigio, anche lì sappiamo in Italia che è un po' più complesso, perlomeno da noi, ma c'è una questione di costo crescente per l'acquisizione dei titoli universitari, una escalation per entrare sul mercato del lavoro in anni di studio. Magari nelle università inglesi e americane è il costo di studio, perché ci sono università molto care. Da noi c'è un'accumulazione che alla fine, insomma, mi sa che alla fine si spende più o meno lo stesso, ma semplicemente spalmando sugli anni l'accumulazione o di titoli o di esperienze professionali per entrare nel mondo del lavoro. Allora, a me pare che il problema, e David tra l'altro vi accennava, è anche una questione dei datori del lavoro e del modo in cui il mercato del lavoro legge i titoli di studio, no, il famoso processo del signaling, per cui il datore di lavoro legge un titolo di studio per avere un'idea di come potrebbe poi il lavoratore essere produttivo, diciamo. Ecco, l'impressione che si ha sul mercato del lavoro è che ci sia un bisogno così forte di ridurre l'incertezza nei processi di reclutamento da sovravalorizzare ogni singola variazione nel merito, per come quantificato dal sistema educativo, che ha raggiunto una dimensione di spreco onorifico eccessivo. Quindi credo, in questo vengo molto incontro a quello che dice David, che ci sia un problema in questo, cioè paghiamo sempre più caro un tentativo di ridurre l'incertezza nei processi di reclutamento che di fatto poi non ci garantisce niente, perché quell'incertezza rimane, e anzi magari sarebbe più disruptive lasciare maggiore incertezza, e questo permetterebbe per esempio di rinnovare anche in termini di diversità, di inclusione delle categorie sociali che non possono accedere a questa escalation formativa. Non abbiamo tantissimo tempo per rispondere a tutte queste cose, ma rilascio la parola a David e poi penso che di spunti comunque ce ne siano tanti.
Whoops. Yeah. Okay, Raffaele. A lot to say about that, but we should also leave some time for people to respond in the audience. Yeah, I mean, I don't think a lot of what I'm saying is quite populist, but I have no problem with that. I mean, I think there is legitimate populism. I think that the main function of politics in our societies now is to find common ground between anywheres and somewheres. And obviously the extremes of sort of conservative and liberal, or left and right, are not necessarily very good at doing that. But there has had to be a rebalancing politically. And I do think, I mean, you know, Brexit, I would partly blame Brexit on British anywheres. I mean, you know, the fact is our kind of whole economic model was built around, our economic and educational model was built around their interests for the last 30 years. It was all about professional and financial services in London and the South East. It was about everyone going to university, neglecting technical skills, filling all the gaps with mass immigration, devaluing or not being so interested in national identity. These were all, you know, this was kind of what dominated, probably not just Britain, but actually many countries in Europe in recent decades. And, you know, these priorities are not the priorities of a very large minority, if not a majority, of our fellow citizens. And we live in democracies, and they're able to use their vote to push back against these priorities, which they have done. The pushback is not without its costs, but I actually think, you know, we have I voted Remain in the Brexit election, but I think we actually have a better balance now, notwithstanding the recent excitement in British politics. We actually have a better balance to our politics because of Brexit in many ways. You know, we had the Conservative Party making it as one of its great priorities dealing with the grotesque regional inequality that we have. It's much worse than in Italy. And that would not have happened without Brexit, essentially changing some of the priorities of the anywhere-dominated political class. So, you know, we've got to find a new balance. I think that's, you know, that is the task of democratic politics now, I think. And of course, you're right. I mean, the concept anywhere covers a lot of. One of the reasons people on the left tend not to like it, because they end up sitting in the same corner as top business people. Lots of top business people are also very liberal-minded. They want very open societies. They want lots of immigration because it's good for business. You know, the top business people and the left-wing academics don't like being bedfellows. Well, certainly the left-wing academics don't like it, but they are. There's no getting away from it. Like I say, they're happy with change. I mean, that's the main thing that distinguishes them from most people. Most people like familiarity. That doesn't make you a xenophobe. I mean, it might make you a xenophobe, but it doesn't necessarily make you a xenophobe. Familiarity is a kind of pretty fundamental human instinct, and it's been overlooked, I think, in all this talk about change and modernization, and it's sort of, it doesn't take sufficient account of people's basic small c conservatism, and that is why populists have been, you know, able to capture the votes of many people, I think.
Io chiedo all'organizzazione se abbiamo ancora tempo per fare delle domande, perché forse siamo in chiusura. Una domanda, quindi è la facciamo qua al centro. Ok, tu, due domande, se potete farle di seguito.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a question. For example, in Britain, you're talking about the fact that healthcare jobs aren't really like nobody wants to work there, for example, or in supermarkets. What if we increased the pay for the basic jobs and only invited like British people to work there? Would it like help the British economy, or would it like explode if we highly increase the pay?
Yeah. Maybe the two questions. Yeah, do the two questions together. Yeah.
In questi 30 anni in cui in questi 30 anni in cui abbiamo fantasticato sulle bellezze della knowledge economy, nel frattempo la produzione è andata via dall'America, dall'Europa, e quindi quei lavori sono stati spostati altrove, la finanza ha preso il possesso tendenzialmente delle grosse aziende, perché rispondono ai shareholders e non alla popolazione. Non è che è stata una grande distrazione di massa questa knowledge economy?
Okay, well, thanks for the questions. The pay and status, I think, of care workers. I think you could say that care workers in Britain, probably here too, that their status went up after the pandemic. More people are now applying to do nursing courses and medical courses in the UK after the pandemic. So, but we have a problem in what one might call the kind of Cinderella sectors. It's not that, I mean, there are lots of jobs in care, you know, the higher professional carers, you know, think of, you know, surgeons and medics and doctors are often incredibly well paid. People who run social services departments, even people who run elderly care homes are often quite well paid. It's the kind of rank and file workers in these sectors are less well paid. Of course, you have to remember these are overwhelmingly female-dominated sectors. I think 89% of nurses in our national health system in the UK are female. 85% of people who work in elderly care homes. 85% of primary school teachers. I mean, beneath the kind of professional elite level, where we're pretty androgynous now, we have a huge gender division of labour. So I think that, you know, one of the reasons why pay is so low is that these are jobs that have historically been done for free in the gift economy of the family, or part-time by women who are also raising children at the same time. So there's a sort of shadow over some of these sectors. So somebody working in, we actually have quite a high minimum wage in Britain, to about £10 an hour. But if you compare one of the kind of basic care jobs with an equivalent job like perhaps driving a bus, the driving the bus job, which is overwhelmingly done by men, is paid about 40% more than the basic care job. I mean, this is just the sort of historic way in which kind of wages, incomes have evolved in different sectors. So, yeah, one of the answers is clearly to pay people in elderly care, in nursery care, you know, looking after young children. These are very, very poorly paid sectors. And they will have to be paid better because we are, well, particularly the elderly care, we're getting much more, we're becoming very much, we're going to, you know, many more people are surviving into their late 80s and 90s. And also because the family has become much weaker, you know, more families have broken up, so there aren't so many intact families to look after elderly people. So the state or the private sector is going to have to take that over. And one of the reasons why the pay is so low in the UK is that much of the funding, the delivery of care to old people is usually in private homes, but the funding of it comes from the state. And so there's a huge constraint on, particularly at the moment, in all European countries, we're trying to, you know, restrain state spending. There never seems to be a good time to increase the pay of people in elderly care homes. But I think the pressure is just going to be enormous. It's one of the few areas of immigration that is quite popular. People, you know, that bringing in nurses and doctors from, but it's morally very dubious, particularly if you're bringing people in from much poorer countries with much worse ratios of, you know, of nurses to people or doctors to people. I mean, it just doesn't really seem right. Anyway, sort of, you're basically saying, should we have much more public ownership? I mean, we probably should in certain sectors. You know, the energy sector, particularly in the UK at the moment, I think is suffering from a very badly designed privatization a few years ago. I mean, I think, you know, I think the idea that everything can be publicly owned and planned, you know, I think that did disappear with the Soviet Union, which doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't have more cooperative ownership and public ownership. But I mean, you know, our corporations are very, very highly regulated. I mean, you know, they don't operate as sort of free beings like in the kind of economic textbooks. I mean, they are, and also, I mean, I think the really promising thing is that, you know, private companies are, you know, hugely influenced by general opinion. I mean, look at the business plans of sort of big corporations now compared to 20 or 30 years ago, and look at how they've had to adjust to climate change, gender equality, lots of things like that. I mean, you might say it's all sort of greenwashing or whatever, but actually, you know, it's had a big impact. I mean, what I mean, so I don't think one should think of the market as a sort of, you know, a whole lot of capitalists sitting around plotting. I mean, the market is kind of us, and you know, and our preferences. But you know, we need to make sure that our preferences are properly understood by the private sector.
Credo che possiamo ringraziare David Goodhart e chiudere qui. Grazie a tutti. Grazie David.